Hello, you're watching Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Julia Kim, and these are the headlines on the continent. New banknotes are distributed in Zimbabwe to help ease chronic cash shortages, but many believe this latest currency reform won't be enough to save the country's collapsing economy. On Monday, our reporters took you to the front line of the Libyan conflict. Today, they meet with civilians caught in the middle. We'll bring you part 2 of our week-long series of exclusive reports from Libya. And climate change brings harvest woes to Zanzibar's seaweed farmers. The industry is the country's second largest source of income after tourism. Let's go first to Zimbabwe, where the central bank today released new coins and banknotes in a bid to ease long-running cash shortages. Customers at commercial banks are only allowed to withdraw $300 a week, equivalent to about €18. President Emmerson Mnangagwa has said his country needs its own currency to develop. For years, Zimbabwe used the US dollar after its national currency was wiped out by hyperinflation more than 10 years ago. That changed, though, in June when the government reintroduced the Zimbabwe dollar as the nation's official currency. Well, let's go now to Harare and speak to France 24's Ryan Truscott. Ryan, how have ordinary Zimbabweans responded to the release of this new money today?
Well, there have been huge queues outside banks dispersing this money. People are very keen for physical cash because they receive discounts from traders on the informal market if they pay in cash rather than with mobile money. Banknotes and coins are also needed for convenience, for things like commuter fares. Only $30 million has been released. That's about 1.8 million euros. That means it's hardly enough to meet demand. But the government says it plans to release around $1 billion in these new notes and coins over the next 6 months. Obviously, that's raised concerns about inflation. Memories are still fresh of the last hyperinflation crisis in 2008, which peaked at 500 billion%. But the authorities say to avoid that happening again, they'll make sure that whatever is released in banknotes and coins, an equivalent amount in electronic dollars will be removed from the country's broad money supply.
Now, are these new banknotes and coins likely to boost Zimbabwe's economy as the government hopes?
Well, it's certainly going to be helpful in the short term because many Zimbabweans buy their goods on the informal market, but you only get discounts there if you pay in cash. Zimbabwe's been critically short of cash for more than 2 years. Most people have been using debit cards or mobile money to pay for goods. While if you're paying in a supermarket, that's not a problem. It is a problem if you're paying at an outdoor market or on the streets because traders there will hike their prices. And economists say that's inflationary. So in theory, these new banknotes should bring down inflation. The big problem is that the informal sector doesn't actually bank its takings. And that means that a lot of this cash that's being released now may end up trapped in the informal sector and not circulating in official banking channels. Because after years of economic crisis, Zimbabweans are wary of the local banking system. They prefer to keep cash at home and not in the bank. How the authorities will combat that, if they can instill enough confidence to get people to hand cash over, well, that remains to be seen.
Okay, Ryan Truscott, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for that update. Let's go now to Nigeria, where security forces have fired tear gas and live rounds into the air to disperse a protest for the release of Omoyele Sowore. A staunch critic of President Muhammadu Buhari, Sowore was detained in August on charges of treason. The 48-year-old journalist had called for a revolution after Buhari's re-election in February. Nigeria's judiciary ordered Sowore's release in September, but his lawyers say state security forces refused to release him. Now, the CEO of Semafo Gold has visited the survivors of last week's deadly attack on a gold mine in Burkina Faso. Benoit Desormeaux spoke to injured workers and promised to pay for their medical bills. At least 39 Semafo employees were killed and more than 60 were wounded when militants ambushed their convoy. The attack occurred about 40 kilometers from the Bungu mine in the country's east. The company says one worker is still missing. It's one of the worst militant attacks Burkina Faso has seen in recent years. Here's the CEO of Canadian-owned Semafo speaking earlier.
It was very important for us to meet the wounded, their families, and to give them all of our support. We hope they all get back on their feet as quickly as possible. That was the purpose of the visit. We are covering the costs for the wounded and have done since they came here. What we have said to the doctors is that if there is anything more we can do, we are here to pay the costs.
Well, let's go to part 2 of our week-long series of exclusive reports from Libya. Just outside the capital, Tripoli, fighting between Western militia and General Haftar's forces continues daily. The number of casualties is unknown, but the UN estimates that at least 120,000 Libyans have been internally displaced since April. The current conflict comes after more than 8 years of violence, sparked by the 2011 revolution and the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. France 24's reporters went to speak to the civilians caught in the middle.
This is a neighborhood in a state of shock. Salahadin in southern Tripoli. For months, the inhabitants have been living in fear of bombings. The night before our filming, one of the tower blocks was hit by mortar fire. 2 children were killed as they slept.
We're afraid. It's terrifying. Every minute we fear we're going to be hit by a shell. We're constantly worried. We don't feel safe.
There's very little independent verification of the toll of this war. Both sides hunt down evidence of crimes against civilians.
That's a part of the bottom of the shell, between the firing pin and the charge. These are imprecise shells, Grad missiles and mortars. Some date back to the Second World War. It's impossible to use them for surgical strikes.
We're here in a very densely populated suburb on the outskirts of the city. You can hear frequently the sounds of the fighting. People here tell us it happens daily. You can hear mortar fire there. And it's especially dangerous after the sun goes down.
The impact of the war is felt throughout Tripoli. The roadsides are stacked with mountains of rubbish. The main landfill site is blocked off by fighting, and garbage collectors are enrolled in militias on the front lines. The UN estimates that at least 120,000 civilians have fled the violence. Here in the neighborhood of Abu Slim, more than 1,000 displaced families are sheltering. Redwan, a former teacher, is now living in this school with his wife and 3 children. They abandoned their home on the front line a few weeks ago.
There was gunfire and mortar shells right by us. My children asked me to leave. They didn't want to stay there. I want to send a message to my brothers in the East and the West. I want them to sit around a table together and find a solution that satisfies both sides. I want to be able to walk safely in the streets.
A wish shared by so many of the Libyans we've spoken to. Since the beginning of this conflict in April, countless lives have been overturned.
That report from our reporters on the ground. Well, finally, Zanzibar's seaweed farmers say climate change is destroying their crop. Rising water levels have forced them to cultivate seaweed further out to sea, but unpredictable weather has also made that risky. The result has meant less algae, damaging the country's second largest source of income. Nicolas Germain reports.
Commercially viable seaweed was first introduced to Zanzibar in the late 1980s from the Philippines. The farms are made up of sticks. Ropes are tied between them and the seedlings are strung between the two. The seaweed is used as a base for cosmetics, lotions, toothpaste, medicine and food in some countries like China. But in recent years, crop yields have dwindled.
We used to farm in a very large area, way over there. When the seaweed yields decreased, we then decided to move, so whenever the crop is spoilt on the other side, we move back here. We keep moving because we are not sure what the cause may be.
Many farmers believe the plants are dying because the sea has become warmer. The average global sea surface temperature has been rising continuously for 100 years, according to a US study. Seaweed farmers and traders are suffering economically.
Before, when the seaweed was not affected by these diseases, we used to plant our seeds every fortnight and count another 4 weeks. Then came the harvest. Now, with climate change, it takes twice the amount of time, meaning that the productivity has gone down drastically.
The women farmers are moving the seaweed bed further out where the water is cooler, but it's also deeper, and the problem is most women in Zanzibar cannot swim.
And that's it for this edition. There's more news coming up next. Stay tuned to France 24.
In 1980, a historic strike, led by a 10 million strong movement called Solidarity, crippled Poland's shipyards in Gdansk. The authorities cracked down on the protest, arresting many and declared martial law. Lech Walesa, the leader of the workers' movement, refused to back down. It took 7 years to finally force the government into making significant concessions. In 1990, Lech Walesa became president of Poland. This was the first time since 1917 that a communist regime was removed through free elections. Under Walensa's leadership, Poland then transitioned into a free market economy. But everyone hadn't embraced the change. Today, the Solidarity Party has cozied up to the Nationalist Party and its anti-European diatribes.
We revisit the fall of communism in Poland, all this week on France 24.